why we believe, as Christadelphians, that God actually controls the destiny of the nations. Probably wasn't that long ago that you cast a ballot. Australia just had an election not too long ago, and you may have had your say, put your ballot paper in, and Australia spoke, and ScoMo got back in. Was it that people wanted Scott Morrison to come back in, or was it that people didn't want Bill Shorten? Well, the debate will continue on, and we'll go down with the historians debating which way it might be. But we as Christadelphians, we believe that God was involved in that election, that he chose who he wanted. And that's why Christadelphians didn't vote in the last election. We call ourselves conscientious objectors, and we would have filled in our forms as to the reasons why, probably using quotes like Daniel 4 verse 17 or Romans 13 verse 1. Or you might still have to do that. It might have just come in the post the other day. And the reason is because we believe that God is in total control. He's the sovereign of the universe, that he has a plan, and that everything is in accordance with that plan. Everything that happens amongst the nations, therefore, is to further that plan in order to bring about his purpose. I just want to remind ourselves of what that purpose is. There's one quote in the Bible that stands out in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 21 as to what is the grand purpose of God. I'm sure that most in this hall will know these words off by heart. Numbers 14 verse 21. It's not a very nice context in which this is written, but nonetheless, it states a truism about God. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with my glory. So that's God's purpose. He has a plan. He wants to fill the earth with his glory. Looking around at the world at the moment, looking at nations, it's quite evident that that's not yet been fulfilled. Those words have not yet occurred. But we firmly believe that everything that's happening is on a trajectory towards that purpose, that God has a plan to fill the earth with his glory. It's a pretty bold statement to say that God's involved in human affairs. But I just want to show you a few words out of Isaiah 40 to begin with, to show us why we believe God is so powerful, why we believe that God can do this. Come over to Isaiah 40, first of all. Let's just gather some information about this God that we as Christadelphians believe handles world affairs according to his purpose. But just a few verses here. It's quite a section here about God, and God's describing himself here, and he's basically challenging the nations and saying, which of you nations can compare yourselves to me? So in verse 12 to verse 17, there's a little section here where God says to the nations, who of you taught me anything? Where did I get my knowledge from? Verse 13, who hath directed the spirit or the mind of the Lord, or being his counselor hath taught him? Who gave me instruction? Was it the nations? Did I get my intelligence, my knowledge from the nations? From the human beings upon the planet? Well, look at verse 15. Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. So that's mentioning Australia there and all the islands. A little thing. We would say today a drop in the ocean. It's the same expression that Isaiah is using back here. That's the nations in God's sight. And there's 193 nations and two, what would you call them, sort of overseeing or satellite nations, Palestine and the Vatican. So 195 that gather at the United Nations Assembly Hall in New York. Of all those 195 nations, collectively joined together with all their intelligence, their capabilities, whether it be military or financial, everything is counted as nothing compared to God. Like a drop in the ocean. Or if you come down to verse 17, All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted to him less than nothing. How do you get less than nothing? Once you've got nothing, you've got nothing. But the nations are counted as being less than nothing. So God's saying, comparing me to the nations, there is no comparison. I am way above any nation upon the earth. So verse 18, he says, to whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare to him? Will you, for example, compare him to, in verse 19, to the rich man's God? So this man, the workman melteth a graven image, and the goldsmith spreadeth it over with gold and casteth silver chains. So this one's quite wealthy. He can afford silver and gold. God's nothing like the rich man's God of gold and silver. And anything that money can buy, God's way above that. Verse 20, he's even uncomparable to the poor man's God. He that is so impoverished that he hath no oblation, chooseth the tree that will not rot. He seeketh unto him cunning workmen to prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. So whether it's the rich man's God or the poor man's God, the God of the Bible, the Holy One of Israel, as Isaiah calls him, is completely above any other God. In fact, in verse 22, it is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth. The word circle there means the orbit. It's a word which means a circle or a compass, and man sends up satellites to conduct a particular orbit depending on where they want it to pass over. And the earth's gravity holds them in that orbit until such time as it is needed for repairs or goes out of service. God is saying that he sits way above any orbit that encompasses the earth. He's above all of that. There is no comparison. So that's the God that we're talking about. He is over every nation. In fact, come over to the reading that we had tonight in Acts 17. Here the Apostle Paul actually says that God created the nations. So Paul, he finds himself in the city of Athens waiting for his friends to join him. And while he was there, Athens was full of idols, to this god and to that god, idols in abundance, which meant that there were gods in abundance. But he came across a particular altar which had, in case they'd missed one out, a phrase on it saying to the unknown God, just in case there was one missing. Well, that's the God that Paul chose to describe to the Athenians when they asked him to stand before him on Mars Hill. I just want to go straight into verse 26. Paul says this, he says, and God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. All nations. It means every nation. So we mentioned that there were 193 nations. So every nation has all come from one human pair. However different their complexion or their features or their language are, they're all derived from a common parent. That's what Paul's first point is there in verse 26. So that means that there's no one nation that's more important than any other nation. There's no one nation more prominent in God's sight. All races are considered equal. He made them all from one set of parents. And then it says that Paul goes on to say about those nations, and hath determined the times before appointed. The word determined, a Greek word, the New Testament was written in Greek, so this Greek word here has the idea to mark out a boundary, to fix a line for a boundary. And that's it, you're in that boundary. A bit like a surveyor might do if you're buying a block of land and you're trying to set out the boundaries of where you're allowed to put your fences up. You'd get a surveyor and he'd mark out, he'd fix the boundary. Well, God did that with every nation. He marked out the boundary. He marked out the boundary of their existence. He fixed the times when each country should be settled, the rise, the prosperity, and then the fall of each nation. He set that in motion. So there's no continent, no island that's been settled by chance. Every island, every continent has been settled in accordance with God's arrangement and design. It's quite an astonishing thought, isn't it? Out of all, 7 billion people on the planet, they're all being orchestrated to settle in the places according to God's boundaries. And then it says that he also has set the bounds of their habitation. In other words, where they can or cannot dwell, where they can or cannot live, the extent of their lands and territory. That is, their borders. So not only the extent of time and their prosperity and their demise, but also the extent of their territory. God has designated the extent of each nation's borders. That's quite a remarkable thing. And this is Paul standing up before these Athenians. I'm not sure really what they thought of him saying this, but every nation is under God's control. Now, when Paul said these words, you'll notice if you've got a Bible with some marginal notes, that these words Paul was quoting from the Old Testament. He had in mind a passage from Deuteronomy. I just want to come back to Deuteronomy, because although Paul doesn't say it here, the words that he's quoting from in Deuteronomy specify that when God set these bounds, he set it in accordance with one particular nation of people. So come back to Deuteronomy 32 just for a moment. So Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8, because this is quite striking. God hasn't just caused nations to rise and fall in a way that seems random or just because it took his fancy. He's got a purpose in mind, and the purpose revolves around one particular nation. Verse 8, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people, and here it is, according to the number of the children of Israel. So you'll notice that some of those words there are what we read in Acts 17. So Paul quotes just that little phrase, and he builds his case before the Athenians. But the context that he takes them from back here shows that when God divided out the boundaries of the nations, he did so with one nation in mind. That one nation is the nation of Israel. Verse 9, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, or Israel, as Jacob's name was changed to, is the lot of his inheritance. So when God divided out the nations, their territory, and where they were going to settle, he made sure that there was a place for his people, Israel, proportional to their numbers, according to the number of the children of Israel. So that whenever the time came, in God's grand plan, for his people to have somewhere to dwell and not be scattered around, God always had a place for them. Just the right size for the right amount of people. And they haven't always been in that place. Sometimes they've not been there. But whenever there's the need for them to be there, God has made sure that the boundaries of the nations would suit his people. So that's introduced another element into this subject tonight. Quite a powerful one. That God's plan, yes, it is to fill the earth with his glory, which is a future event still to come and hasn't yet happened. But this verse is saying that God's plan is to preserve forever one people, the people of Israel. In fact, all world affairs are governed by God inasmuch as it impacts upon that one people. So world affairs, elections that come and go, all happen in accordance as to whether or not it affects God's purpose with Israel. It's quite an astonishing thing. Now, let's go back to Isaiah again. Just come to the next chapter in Isaiah, Isaiah 41. This is Isaiah's point. He goes on to build a case about God protecting his people and that he can conduct world affairs, and that he's got the proof that he conducts world affairs. Isaiah 41, verse 14. Fear not, thou worm Jacob, and ye men of Israel, I will help thee, saith the Lord, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. So the introduction to this little section here in verse 14, which goes down to about verse 24, God says, I will protect Israel. So that when, in verse 17, when they seek water, when the poor and needy seek water and there is none, and their tongue faileth for thirst, I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in high places and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I will provide for them wherever they are, whatever their need. And of course, God has done that. If you were to visit Israel prior to the Jews occupying that land again, vast quantities of it were desert. But they've reclaimed a lot of that land. Tel Aviv, the sort of bustling metropolis of Tel Aviv, which is the biggest city in Israel, was built on swampland in many places. Now, verse 20, God says, the reason I've done this, the reason I'm protecting this people and providing for them, is so that they may see and know and consider and understand. He's pretty pointed, isn't he? I want them to see something here. That the hand of the Lord hath done this. I am God, I can do this. The Holy One of Israel hath created it. But I want you to notice the next verses. Because now God turns to the nations. He turns to those 193 nations and says, why don't you produce your cause? Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Bring them forth and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things, that is, things in the past, what they be, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. In other words, what nation out there that's trying to forge their way through life can bring forth the reason for their existence, what their purpose is, why history has taken the course that it has for them, why history will continue in a particular path for them. Bring forth your reasons. Show us your findings. Bring forth your evidence that you control your own destiny. Which nation out there can demonstrate that they control their own destiny? Show the purpose of history and also predict the course of the future. Which nation could do that? Why has history taken this path for that nation? And why does it continue along this particular pathway? Do you think there would be a nation that could do that? If you were to go to the United Nations today and stand up in the General Assembly Hall and ask the nations to bring forth their reasons, bring forth their evidence and show their case that they can control their own destiny. Verse 24. God says to these nations what he said in chapter 40. Exactly the same thing. You are nothing. Your works are of naught, and an abomination is he that chooseth you. Any nation that brings forth their evidence, brings forth their works, whether it be the United Nations work in Somalia or Rwanda or Bosnia or any of those areas in the world, bring forth and say, look, we can control destiny. God says you are nothing. The United Nations can't declare anything as a collective body. Neither can even single nations. I mean, who can predict what the outcome of the last G7 meeting might mean? Or Trump's trade war with China? What's the end result? Who knows? No one can predict the destiny of nations other than God. Now, of course, just a couple of pages more, in chapter 43, God does have evidence that he controls destiny of nations. He can bring forth witnesses. And without going through this chapter in any detail, he does say in verse 10 about Israel that you are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am the Lord, and beside me there's no Saviour. Now I know that just recently Mr. Trump thought he was the Saviour. He sort of turned up and said, I'm the chosen one, in that little speech in front of some journalists just the other day, and little does he know just how much God's using him as part of God's plan. There is no other Saviour other than God. God has his evidence that he is in control. It's the Jewish people. Now, why are the Jewish people so special? Well, come back to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. God made a promise to the fathers of the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. He made a promise to their father Abraham. And everything that's ever happened since that time has been to keep this promise. So in verse 1 of Genesis 12, now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Now there's a lot of detail in all of this here. I just want to pick up this phrase in verse 3. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. There's a number of elements to this promise here. Not all of it relevant for our topic tonight. But that first line in verse 3 demonstrates that God said to Abraham that anyone that blesses you and your people that come from you, I will bless. Any that curse you, I will curse. And history has been made up of nations that have prospered or waned based on their approach to the nation of Israel. That's remarkable. You are my witnesses. And a nation's approach to how they handle the Middle Eastern affairs, and the nation of Israel in particular, is how God deals with them as a nation. Now, the clearest prophecy of God's control of the nations must have to be Daniel chapter 2. I just want to come to Daniel 2 for a moment, because God's witnesses are his people. The nation of Israel are a sign of his evidence that he is at work, and try as you might to get rid of the Jewish people, you never will. The fact that they're still there against all the odds when they should have been wiped out years ago, the odds have been stacked against them in every century, right down through the ages of time. And yet, this people of about 12 million people, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, still survive, still exist because God said they would. But God's given a prophecy in Daniel chapter 2 to demonstrate that he knows everything about the nations, every single detail. Now, I don't propose to go through this chapter in any detail. I think most of us would know it quite well. Just a couple of things that I think to take out of this, because I want to finish on something that's really current, that's going on right as we speak, where God is working in the nations to bring about his purpose. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the then known world was the empire of Babylon. It encompassed all of that territory of the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, as it was known then. And God gave this king a dream which was so real, so stark, that it frightened him. And this dream just kept on being repeated all through the night, and it kept on waking him up. And he couldn't sleep. His sleep broke from him, and this dream just kept on being repeated to him. And of course, he took it as a sign of something, and he wanted to know, what did it mean? Now, all his wise men, so-called, couldn't help him. But one young man, he was an apprentice at the time, he was in his 3-year scholarship, he hadn't quite qualified as a wise man, heard about the decree that all the wise men be killed, and said to his advisor, Arioch, "Don't kill all the wise men. Take me in before the king. I will tell him what the dream means." So this 17-year-old lad, with the confidence of God behind him, goes in before the king and tells the king what the king wanted to know. Now, the king wasn't a silly man. The king had been asked by his wise men to describe the dream. And he said, "Well, I'm not telling you the dream, because then you'll just make some airy-fairy thing up and come back to me, and it will sound nice because I've already told you the dream. I need to know, absolutely know, convincingly, that you're telling me the truth. You tell me what I dreamt, then tell me what it means." Now, of course, that's beyond human capabilities, and that's what they told him. No one can do this except the gods. Daniel comes and said, well, there is a God that can do this. And so Daniel had the dream revealed to him by God, and then Daniel revealed that to the king. Now, basically, this dream was an outline of world history. It showed the way nations would come and go. It would show their abilities to rise as an empire. And there would be 4 that would follow each other over the course of history, and then the final one would break down into a number of smaller nations, and there would never be one world empire as such that existed from the days of Babylon. Now, so remarkable is this dream. If you haven't considered it before, I would suggest that this becomes your project to read through and digest everything about this chapter. I don't propose to do that tonight. But if you haven't done it, this would be the first place to go to prove that God knows everything before it happens. It's so remarkable, this chapter, that very few can accept that it could have been written by Daniel in the first place. Because Daniel lived in the years BC, well, he was about 17 years old in BC 606, and he lived right through to the end of the Babylonian Empire and into a little bit of the combined empire of the Medes and the Persians. In BC 536, the Empire of Babylon collapsed, and Daniel lived about another 2 years into the new empire of the Medes and the Persians. So 600 years or so before Jesus Christ, Daniel lived and wrote these things down. So accurate was it that many can't accept that it was written in BC 600, that it must have been written more likely in BC 200, when the Romans were already on the scene. But we accept that Daniel wrote it in the years that he lived. And it proves to us, as Christadelphians, that the accuracy of Daniel's description of this shows that God is able to predict the future. He's shown the course of history, why it's taken this path. It's to preserve his people. And it's going to continue to take this path because it's all about his people. Now, in verse 34, an aspect of this dream that's described here, "Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So this great image was going to be smashed and ground in pieces all at the same time. Now that proves a bit of a puzzle, because if the image is representing individual nations that come and go, if the gold's come and gone, and then the silver has come and gone, how is it possible that something might come and destroy them all at the same time? Now, this is an element of the dream that Christadelphians interpret as an event that's still yet to happen. So while it is talking about an outline of world history of nations that succeed nations, the Babylonians, and then the joint power of the Medes and the Persians, then Alexander and the Grecians, and then the Romans, and then the breakdown of the Roman Empire, while it is describing an outline of world history, there's something else being described as well. An event to take place whereby one power will control all the territories that was once occupied by the golden, the silver, the brazen, and the iron empires of the past. One power will control that. That's quite a big territory if you put all those territories together. It goes from the river Indus over in India right across to the United Kingdom, funnily enough, up to Hadrian's Wall in the United Kingdom, and all around the Mediterranean area. Now, I mention that because Bible students, Christadelphians, are known for wanting to know every prophecy of the Bible and make sure that they're all unlocked and that they fit together. There's another prophecy in the Bible. In fact, there's a number of other prophecies in the Bible that talk about the United Kingdom, but not as being part of this image empire. And you say, hey, we've got a conflict here. We've got a problem. Because this image empire involves the Roman Empire, which involved Julius Caesar coming over and invading the Brits and occupying that country for a number of years. So, how do we reconcile this? I don't propose to go through where Britain's mentioned in Scripture. I think many of us may be aware. I just want to show you Ezekiel 38, which shows a verse, along with many others, such as Isaiah 60 and Psalm 72, that talk about a power called the Tarshish power. And it's quite clear that this Tarshish power is not part of the conglomerate power of the European nations that's represented by Daniel's image in totality. It's on the opposite side. It's quite different. It opposes the power of this image. Just have a look. Ezekiel 38. In verse 1 to verse 11, or verse 12, a confederacy of nations is described as coming down and sweeping over the land of Israel and taking the mountains of Israel. And it's going to happen in a time frame called the latter years, in verse 8. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel. So this particular period in Israel's history is after they've gone scattered and they've been brought back. They've been brought back from the sword. In that period of time, which has to be post-1948, a big confederacy of nations is going to sweep down, verse 9, like a storm to cover the land. Huge power coming down. We call it the Gogian Confederacy because it's headed up by an individual called Gog. And they're going to sweep down and suck the life out of Israel and come against the mountains of Israel. But in verse 13, there are going to be some who oppose this. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. Now, without any time to go through and describe who these are, we suggest that Tarshish is a biblical name for Britain. And Tarshish is mentioned in a number of places in the Bible as being opponents to this Confederate power. Just last week, Boris Johnson, the new British Prime Minister, cancelled Parliament. He's going to introduce a Queen's speech, and he's taken everybody by surprise, absolutely taken them by surprise. And in the next period of time, until now, and October the 31st, which is the deadline for Brexit, he's taken 5 weeks out of the parliamentary calendar, and Parliament has been suppressed. It's legal, he's allowed to do it, but it's against everything that's ever happened in the past. And he's playing his cards. He thinks he's controlling what's going to happen to the British people and their negotiations and their exit from the European Union. We as Christadelphians have been expecting this for many, many years. In fact, over the last 170 years or so, Christadelphians have actually been expecting that Britain never be involved with Catholic Europe. And then to our surprise, in 1973, Edward Heath took the British people into Europe, along with Ireland. The two of them joined in 1973. And we re-looked at the Bible passages, we looked at the prophecies, and we saw that there has to be a breaking of these two powers. That Britain cannot be associated with the European Union, because all the prophecies demonstrate that this power is separated. And we've been expecting and we've been preaching from this platform and many around the world that Britain will leave Europe. Now, you just think about the enormity of that. Put yourself in the position of a European over there who's involved, thinking, how did this come about? How are we in the position that we are now? You see, prior to June 2016, it was against all the odds that Britain would even, in a referendum, vote to leave Europe. And yet in June 2016, a vote was held, and the margin so close, 48.2% versus 51.8%. The margin was just tipped over, and the unthinkable happened. And a referendum that was held in Britain said, let's leave. And then Theresa May, the Prime Minister that succeeded David Cameron, said, okay, let's thrash out a deal. And she thrashed out this deal, and she was weakened in that because she went to the British people in an election and she tried to seek a stronger mandate, and she lost her majority. She lost her majority. So what did she have to do? She had to team up with another smaller power from Northern Ireland. The DUP party had 10 members, and they had an agreement that they would back Theresa May when it mattered in Parliament. So her mandate was weakened. She thrashed out this deal, and it got rejected in Parliament by the biggest margin ever in British history. 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. And now Boris Johnson's in. Now, Christadelphians have been expecting that Britain would leave the European Union with no deal, because all ties with the European Union, with Catholic Europe, have to be broken. And what looked absolutely unthinkable in June 2016 was, okay, well, we're going to leave, but let's have a deal. And now the unthinkable is starting to become a reality, that they're going to leave with no deal. No one wants it, the opposition parties, for the first time in their lives probably, have all got together to collectively say, let's do this together and try and get Parliament to vote that a no deal cannot happen. And Boris Johnson's just closed the window. And you say, why is this all happening? How is this all happening? God's in control. God's known that this day would come for hundreds of years. For hundreds of years. So back in the 1600s, he allowed Britain to go and invade Ireland, and Ireland became part of the United Kingdom. In 1801, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was the entity of that people, of that kingdom. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But of course, as time went on, there was much unrest in the late 1800s. And Ireland wanted to break free from the United Kingdom. And so there was the Free State of Ireland that was proposed. And all the Irish would break free. Well, in 1923, that's what happened. But unbeknown to Britain, who said, yes, you can all go and become your own kingdom. 6 counties in Ireland said, we don't want to. Just 6. That's right, 6 counties up in Northern Ireland said, no, we want to stay loyal to the Union. The Unionists, predominantly made up of Protestants. Back in 1923, who thought that that would be the thorn that would break this whole deal over? Because what's stopping this deal from taking place is the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The backstop. The backstop border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, the insurance policy that the EU want to make sure that they preserve their single market, is the undoing. Boris Johnson says it has to go, and the EU is saying we can't let it go. So October 31st is looming up, and it's do or die. And of course, if Theresa May did have her mandate, if she did get a majority, she wouldn't need the Northern Ireland Party of the DUP to support her. The deal would have gone through. Would have gone through a long time ago. But the DU party have said, no, we will not support that. We will not give you your majority. And you think, how has this all taken place? Every step of the way, God has narrowed down the options until there's only one left. Precisely the option that Bible students have been expecting. And so on October the 31st. Now, I'm not saying that it's a done deal, that it's going to be a no deal. I'm not in the position of God. But looking at Bible prophecy, looking at these scriptures, we say that God is in control. He's written these scriptures down. He can predict the future because he makes the future happen. And so on October the 31st, we should not be one bit surprised if Boris Johnson gets his way, having dissolved Parliament, and says, let's get this done. And it's do or die. We leave without a deal. We leave under the WTO trade agreements. That's what prophecy is expecting. Now, you think how much time that took place to put into motion, that God and his angels had to work out all of those things that took place in the 1600s, in the 1700s, in the 1800s, in the 1900s, and in the last 4 years. That every leader that's taken place has been furthering God's purpose. He is in control. And it's happening exactly as he predicted. Now that's just one small element. Daniel 2 encompasses far more than just the current Brexit negotiations that are taking place. Ezekiel 38 encompasses far more than just the breaking away of the Britain from the European Union. All of these things are being controlled by God, and it's playing out exactly as Christadelphians have expected over the last 150, 170 years. So friends, we invite you to check these out. Go and do your own research. Go and take up God's challenge. He's put the challenge down. He said, produce your causes. If you can't do that, just stop and say, I accept. I accept that I can't do anything about this. you're in control. Just come back to Isaiah 43. Let's just finish with these words here. This should be our response. I just want to finish with these words and leave this with you to think about. God is in control of the destiny of the nations. Verse 9. Let all the nations be gathered together. Put yourself into that position. Let all the people of the nations be gathered together, and let the people be assembled. Who among them can declare this and show us former things? Who can show the reason for things in the past? Let them bring forth their witnesses, that they may be justified. So there's the challenge. You can do that if you wish. Bring forth your reasons as to why you think history's taken the course that it has, or that the future will take the course that it will. But if you can't, and of course none of us can, it'd be ridiculous to think that we could, or let them hear and say it is truth. And that's the challenge that I leave with every one of you, to go away and say, well, if you can't bring your reasons, if you can't produce any evidence of your own, if you can't find a nation to bring forth any evidence, then the challenge now is to accept that God is speaking the truth.